It is such a pleasure to participate in this webinar organized by WIZO Australia on WIZO at the United Nations. We are all very much aware of the extraordinary work that WIZO does in the social welfare field, but we are less aware of the role that WIZO plays in the international arena. There are at this moment 12 international Jewish organizations that have consultative status at the United Nations. But WIZO is different. And we are different because we are at the United Nations because we were invited specifically by the Secretary General of UNICEF, an American diplomat by the name of Henry LaBouise, to start working in United Nations programs. And why did it happen? Mr. LaBouise, before he came to UNICEF, he had been the executive of UNRWA, the United Nations agency that was in charge of the Palestinian refugee camps. So when he came to Tel Aviv and he visited our WIZO institutions, and he was very much impressed by one establishment that actually doesn't exist anymore, and that was the WIZO Mothercraft Training Center in Tel Aviv for premature babies. And Mr. LaBouise, he had a dream. He thought that peace would come soon, and WIZO would be able to take care also of the premature babies that were dying on a daily basis in the UNRWA camps. At the present time, we have not only consultative status with UNICEF, but we also have consultative status with the Economic and Social Council, ECOSC, at the United Nations, and its commissions of status of women, Human Rights Council, social development, UNESCO, and all other agencies that work in the social welfare field. What do we do exactly at the United Nations? WIZO has specifically delegations at UN headquarters here in New York, in Geneva at UN headquarters there, and in Vienna, where the first deliberations of the Commission of Status of Women took place. What do we do at the United Nations? Yes, we participate in the yearly activities and in the yearly meetings of the Commission on the Status of Women that is called today UN Women. We have participated in all the women's conferences, first in Mexico City, then in Copenhagen, in Nairobi, in Beijing, and in New York. We work at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, in UNICEF, and we have active participation in all United Nations programs that fight violence against women and children, and that have programs on gender equality, climate change, environmental issues, and so on. We are also active here in New York with the Department of Public Information of the United Nations that organizes in 57 countries programs on education of the Holocaust and memorial of the Holocaust. And they organize week-long activities every year in the months of January to educate the world about the horror of the Holocaust. As I said before, we were invited to participate in the United Nations because of the respect that they had about our professionalism, about the kind of work that we were doing on the field. But in the 70s and 80s, that kind of respect disappeared. Zionism was equated with racism, and our work, and we were continuously challenged at the United Nations. Our status was challenged. As a matter of fact, the Committee of Non-Governmental Organizations of ECOSOC tried to kick us out of the United Nations on a few occasions, at the same time that the United Nations was challenging the credentials of the State of Israel. And we, WIZO, we were the only organization that had its international headquarters in Israel. Therefore, we were looked up as the enemy. I must say that this year also is the 45th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 3379. I will never forget that number, the resolution that equated Zionism with racism. And although it was rescinded 16 years later with the help of President Bush I, the harm that that resolution did to the Jewish people still continues to follow us until today. It is the basis of the international BDS movement. And hardly 1 week goes by in some place in the world where in an academic conference or in an NGO conference or in a university or college campus, Zionism is not equated with racism, with colonialism, with apartheid. That is the terrible legacy of that Resolution 3379 of the United Nations. But it has another terrible legacy. At the same time, that was the moment that Arafat appeared holding a gun in his right hand at the General Assembly of the United Nations. A whole Palestinian bureaucracy was established in the international body. Palestinian unit, a Palestinian division, the Committee for the Irreparable Rights of the Palestinian People, the Committee for the Self-Determination of the Palestinian People, a Committee for the celebration of the 29th of November as a Palestinian Day, and on and on and on. Those were all committees, a bureaucracy that was established not only in New York, but also in Geneva and at UNESCO in Paris. This year, WIZO, together with other Jewish organizations and the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, we decided that the moment had come to stop that extraordinary bureaucracy at the United Nations, and we lobbied major responsible governments at the United Nations in order to stop that bureaucracy, because they were doing nothing to work for peace or dialogue. The only thing that they were doing in all those committees and conferences was to elaborate more and more hundreds of resolutions of condemnation of Israel. And at this moment, I would like to specifically express our gratitude to the various governments of Australia, to the mission of Australia at the United Nations, his ambassador, Mr. Mitch Fifield, and especially the Australian ambassador at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, Ms. Sally Mansfield, that not only they voted against those myriad of resolutions against the state of Israel, but she had the guts, she had the courage to stand up to the hypocrisy of those governments that were supporting the text of those anti-Israel resolution. So on behalf of the Jewish people, and certainly on behalf of WIZO, we are very grateful to Ambassador Sally Mansfield. We are now 80 years after the Shoah, and anti-Semitism is on the rise. Actually, anti-Semitism is even rampant in many places of the world. We have a Secretary General at the United Nations now, luckily, that is a great friend of the Jewish people, and is also a friend of the State of Israel. And he has established a special rapporteur at the United Nations, Mr. Ahmed Shahid, whose sole responsibility is to follow on governments. What are they doing to combat anti-Semitism? What kind of laws and programs are they supporting in order to stop this terrible virus that anti-Semitism has become in so many places? So last week, the Ambassador Ronald Lauder, who is also the president of the World Jewish Congress, awarded the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Gutierrez, with the Theodor Herzl Award. We have come truly full circle. Here you had the Secretary General of the organization that had said originally that Zionism was a terrible thing, that Zionism was racism. There he stood, receiving the Theodor Herzl Award, the award that carries the name of the founder of Zionism. We have really come into, as I say, full circle, but it was also a very, very emotional and historical moment in the history of the United Nations. We have another important development at this time. Of course, it's the Abraham Accords. These new peace treaties that are being signed by Israel with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Sudan, and hopefully with some more countries in the Middle East. Those are truly important winds of peace that are blowing in the Middle East. And they're showing that after 70 years of hatred and war, there is the possibility of reconciliation. And that is very, very important for us. The only thing that we can truly ask for, hopefully, hope for, that those same winds of change that are bringing reconciliation in the Middle East will also start blowing here at the United Nations and all its agencies. So to all my friends, my colleagues in WIZO, and especially to the young generation, I would like to tell you that it's important for us to be involved in the major issues of our time. Now that we are celebrating this year the 100 years of WIZO, 60 years of WIZO's presence in the international arena, I can tell you that our objectives have not changed. We still support 100% the State of Israel, and we shall fight all the efforts to delegitimize our only Jewish state in the international arena. But we also support, and we strongly support, all development programs of the United Nations, programs that are trying to conquer poverty, suffering, discrimination, programs that are so important in gender equality, in climate change, on environmental issues that are affecting the health, not only our private health, the health of the whole planet. As Jews, we know that we cannot afford to be apathetic or indifferent or even ignorant. But as WIZO members, we know the secret. The secret is to get involved, to be active participants in issues that affect the State of Israel, that affect our own countries, and that affect humanity as a whole. Thank you very much.